Philosophers talk to our times towards an ethnography of a self-poisoning mind. One of the things that has clearly gone rampant, that makes a chord difficult, that actually makes it difficult to be a cogent, logical, rational, post-enlightenment human being, is the raging of empirical language so that it becomes the norm throughout society in a way that will only pull minds apart on their own axis. Can you pull apart on your own axis? No, I think you can. Pulled in different directions in such a way you cannot reconcile and find a medium point. But let me explain, because it isn't obvious. Empirical language is a phrase I probably got from somewhere else, that I've been working on throughout my entire philosophical career, off and on and off. It's the understanding of that language that is really only partially verbal. But to say it's based on gestures is also wrong. I'll tell you when you've learnt it, when you see it most. I'll give you two examples. First of all, it's the language by which you communicate with dogs. I spend a lot of life communicating with dogs. And to say that dogs understand language when you communicate to them in sentences is nonsense. They don't understand a word of it. But they know it's wrong. They understand a few words. I would reckon my old clever spaniel, he had a vocabulary of about 100 words he was happy with. I don't think he knew how to decline a verb. And the past tense was a mystery to him. He didn't get that. But he got it all. He got what he needed to work out from the emotion. So he could work out from the emotion, because he was watching that all the time, what was being communicated in the words. And so it was a torrent of feeling expressed within words, but I could have expressed it other ways, but humans express things in words. And then one or two that he picked out and knew what was happening. Her vocabulary is about 30 words at the moment. It's going up. She's 4, and I talk to her quite often, well, all the time when I'm not talking to you. So her vocabulary, her ability to associate words with places, but also my emotions, is growing. So an empirical language will pull together 3 different elements: an immediate context within which the language is inhabited, a perceptual context, if you like, a word or two, and a whole set of feelings. It's difficult to have an empirical language if you don't have the context. They're very context dependent. And impossible unless you have a whole set of feelings. Another example would be living in France. Living in France within perfect French is an exercise in empirical language. Because when people talk to you, you can usually work out what's going on. Now, if you say, do I understand every word? No, I don't. I'm getting better. Actually, it gets more boring when you get better. I'll come back to that. But that's not what you're doing. What you're doing is you're picking up the emotion, and you're picking up enough phrases and a context to be able to understand. So the language is quite an efficient means of communication. It's a messy means of communication, because actually empirical language always has more possibilities. It's almost a disappointment when your French gets better and you work out what people are saying. It's almost as if the empirical language is the rich, dark precursor for all language. All language, that's a very pompous statement. Once you have language, or once you're caught up within it, it is its dark precursor. It's that which also accompanies your understanding, that you tend to, when you're in your mother tongue, just ignore. You dismiss. The feelings, though, that you really augment when you are not a master of the language. But such empirical languages, then, are more than just ways we communicate with each other. They're also ways, I think, we communicate with ourselves. The ways we take feelings within ourselves. And through externalizing them in a certain way, through 1 or 2 words, through feeling them, we actually allow other bits of ourselves to understand what we are. It is that feeling you get then when you, because I would also call this empirical language, because empirical language is an exchange. Let's do it this way. You will notice Although I'm doing this in this section, it really belongs to a separate book of its own, a book I have absolutely never written and probably never ever get round to doing. Which means that the idea is a little bit incandescent. It shifts and changes because I'm following a thread. But one of the things that empirical language does, another aspect of it, is that it isn't just in the communication. Anything that is tied to feeling and to emotion would never be like that. Emotion is always more incandescent, and the very expression of it changes what it is. So one of the things that an empirical language does is that it shifts what it says as it says it. Okay? Now, that isn't true when you're using empirical language to understand other people's language. I have to say it is true when you're a dog. Absolutely, it is true when you're a dog. Because dogs live only in pure empirical language. When you are trying to understand French through empirical French, you are always holding that language up to a different accord. You're trying to then reconcile it within a slightly different framework, what I would call true language. Or not transcendental language, perhaps. So let's go Kantian, shall we? So the empirical language is a means to an ends, but it means you're very aware of it. Okay? But most of the time, we actually use empirical language as a way of expressing our thoughts to each other. So there's all the feelings you get when you are saying something that is difficult, important, dangerous, something that needs to be said, something that helps you think. And it's a sequence of words, but those words are said towards emotions. If I want to process emotion, if I want to think about how I will want to think about something or change it or shift it, I'll say it to myself. And the words matter because the words are inhabited within the emotion. But it's almost like the emotion calls up the words. It's really that way around. And how sensible, how logical it is, I think is complicated. And you will say it not in the same way to somebody else, but in a similar way and for the similar effect. Because the way the communication works is by pulling out the emotion, seeing how it is reflected in their eyes. You change what it is within you. And so that the empirical language is like a moment of accord, a moment in which you reach out to somebody else, they reflect it back to you and it changes. And then you reflect it back to them and it changes again. So it becomes kind of like a shuttlecock where the actual meaning of the words is given in the feeling. It's not given in what the words say. It's given in the way they are relating to a feeling. They don't have their external reference point. Yes, is their context, because it will need a context in which it is said. And then the feeling that is caught up in their context. And they're all shifting one within the other. And so you end up with... as a storyteller, stories are always... One of the things you do with a good story is you invent, for a while, a quick empirical language. Because that's what a story does. It allows people to understand, inhabit emotions. To understand a single phrase becomes different. It's like a chorus line. It changes its meaning. It invites you to possess it. A great songwriter once told me that was the secret of a chorus. What you wanted is something that didn't make sense in itself, but would, over the course of the song, suddenly burn its power into you. So the first thing you heard was the emotional intensity of a phrase that didn't make sense. Then gradually that sense was inhabited, until by the end of the song you're singing, you're roaring the chorus as if it was your own, as if it always made sense to you. And that's empirical language working. Working because you're creating communication, you're creating communication between people. It is communication linked to words that only have that meaning in that very particular context, as it grows in power. It's not a private language, but it is always a localized language. Those people singing the song will have those words that mean that. I might quote the lyric. You might recognize it, but you might not. And by quoting it, of course, I'm communicating in some kind of empirical language to you. It's one of the things that quotes do. Quotes that tell an entire story if you just quote them. Empirical language is very much the stuff of couples. A successful couple will always have various sets of quotes, various ways to talk to each other that don't much make sense beyond the context and beyond who they are. Okay, I've spent 10 minutes now, talking about a philosophical theory. How does this relate to the poisoning mind? Well, the point about the internet, of course, is that it radically and greatly increases the number of empirical languages that there are. It opens up endless possibilities that you have much more complicated empirical languages. It's no longer between what you and somebody else. It was always the essence, you see, of an empirical language. It was you shouting at your dog. Two of you. It was a limited language. It was a storyteller performing to a certain audience and all the emotion rippling through that audience. It was very much spontaneous, of the moment, in the power of a here and now. And the internet, computers, the ability to communicate images and words, the ability to be caught up in feelings, is clearly tapping into that ancient, very primitive empirical language, the language's dark precursor that allows you to say things without saying them. And what does that do? It creates tribes. That's what it does. One of the things that empirical language is all about is building its own context. So it builds endless tribes. And we all join, as we are all caught up within the empirical language of XR or the empirical language of MAGA, a whole series of assumptions, of emotions that flash one to the other, that have no truth beyond their own reference point and the context within which they are made. And of course, as one human being, you'll be involved in many conflicting empirical languages. There's nothing about empirical language that says that two languages need to be reconciled. On the contrary, they're usually not. I speak both fluent post-rational thought, but also fluent post-Crowley thought. I can do both. Both work as semi-empirical languages for me. I know which one I accept more. But I can certainly do the Crowley speak. I can certainly think in terms of mysticism, and I can communicate very well in terms of it and pour my emotions into it. Because for me, it is an empirical language. It is a way of thinking about emotion, about a way of thinking about the world, a context within which I can inhabit a time. And therefore, I don't need to think about it in terms of logic. But once you get caught within a certain nexus, I think is the word I want to say, of empirical languages, you will tend to be dragged this way or dragged that way. You will create minds then, where reconciliation between their elements becomes impossible, where in fact the enlightenment becomes something that really did happen somewhere else. For empirical languages are not enlightened languages. They're not systems that give you an entire set of thoughts. On the contrary, they're always localized. But computers pull out that localization from one place to no place. And in an empirical language noted in a game, in a whole sequence of exchanges, in a Reddit thread, becomes a strange device, like a myth that is endlessly finding its own meaning, its own truth, like a story in which you are all part of, which you are all telling, which has no real end, just endless looping repetitions. It becomes, in such a world, very difficult to work out where your feelings begin and the feelings of the story you're a part of end. You're caught up, mesmerized by some computer game and would sacrifice your love for it. Is not that the story of our times? Empirical language has become dangerous. That most intimate way that we communicate one to ourselves and to each other has become free-floating. And free-floating makes it problematic, for it was never meant to be like that. This is the logic of the witch craze hunt, which would be another example, I suppose, of it happening. It is the logic that humans are at their most dangerous when they're caught in such empirical languages, open-ended words, stories that they're part of that never get finished. But the story in the end, I think, insofar as human history could ever teach you lessons, is that the story in the end goes dark.